All right, it's a great pleasure for me to introduce Dr. Jeffrey de Laforcade. We first met under the cloud of the Icelandic volcano in Europe in 2010. I don't know, you weren't even born yet, but a big ash cloud had gone up into the sky and was preventing flights from going out, so we were all stuck in Europe, a terrible place to be stuck. But ever since then, we've seen each other periodically at conferences, and he's been here before to BYU to speak with my students, but this is his first opportunity to speak to a little bit bigger audience. Dr. de Laforcade was born in France, but raised in both the United States and France. Has worked on a number of fields, including as an actor, a journalist, covering Africa, and has taught at a number of universities. He's been at Norfolk State for the last many years. He has published on insurgency and revolution, among many other subjects. He's co-edited books such as The Aliens Within, Danger, Disease, and Displacement in Representations of the Racialized Poor, also Migration, Diaspora, and Exile, Narratives of Affliction and Escape.
Affiliation.
Oh, sorry, affiliation.
Yeah, affliction is different.
Sorry. He writes about a lot of affliction as well.
Right.
And he is currently preparing a book called Eluding States, Fugitivity, Sovereignty, and Resistance. I could go on and on. The list of his accolades is long, but we'll let him speak now. So he'll speak for a while, but you'll have a few minutes at the end for Q&A, and we'll have either me or someone else pass the microphone around. I know some of you have class at 4. I also have class at 4, and so there might be some exodus, Jeff, but it's not against you. It's the class schedule.
Try to be
so let's give a hand to Dr. de Laforcade.
Thank you. Second time at Brigham Young, and I really like this place. You can hear me, right? So I like to say that I'm of a mixed Phoenician and Viking ancestry. That's the kind of European I am. Mediterranean, but also with actual genetic roots in Normandy. And I come from a military family. Had my father not had polio, I probably would have been an officer in the French army. Instead, he emigrated to the United States and was a small businessman. He never really decided to come to the United States, kept taking us back to France, and hence I became kind of a world traveler, multilingual. Ended up in southern France, Aix-en-Provence, Marseille, Arles. But because I had a PhD from Yale University, I kept getting pulled back here to work. And I became a Latin Americanist. Now, the thing is about Latin America that I think you should know before I even talk about indigeneity is that all of the nations of Latin America, with a few exceptions in the Caribbean, got their independence from Spain in the early 19th century. So it's a different colonial world than the one that we usually talk about in the late 19th century, right? They had already been through hundreds of years of administration by the early modern Spanish and Portuguese empires. And they were organized in such a way that the countries that came out of them roughly correspond to the Capitanías Generales or the Audiencias or the various levels of institutionality. There were two main viceroyalties. One was New Spain, Mexico, and the other one was Peru. And then late in the 18th century, they added two more viceroyalties. One that was in New Granada that included Venezuela, and the other one that was based in Buenos Aires and was called Rio de la Plata, right? So the reason I say that is that at the beginning of the 19th century, Latin American borders were still not quite defined. There were a lot of wars and a lot of, breakups of various early attempts at federations. Simón Bolívar would have loved to see just one continent under one system of rule. And when the dust settled in the mid-19th to late 19th century, Latin America was a highly dependent, sometimes industrializing part of the world, closely connected to European industrialization and North American industrialization, in a dependent manner, of course, but it also had its frontier. People started migrating by the tens and hundreds of thousands, immigrants from Europe around the same time that they did here. In fact, they were on their way here. They went to Buenos Aires and then would go up to Santos, Sao Paulo, and work their way up to Ellis Island. So I began to study Latin American migration as European migration. Why? Because when I was going to school, it was explained to me that the Mayan people of Central America, whom I knew a lot about, for example, being Mayan and indigenous, I, as a white French person, could never understand them. And therefore, I shouldn't do doctoral work on a community that, was that distant from my own. The same thing happened. I had a strong interest in the African diaspora. And of course, I lived in Africa for a while and worked as a journalist as a young man. But I was informed that it would not be very becoming for me in the 1990s to speak for black people in Latin America, considering that I was a white guy from France. So the identity politics back then were very, the pressure was there. I can't believe I actually agreed to this, but I studied Italian, Spanish, and Central European immigrants to Argentina and became an expert on labor and migration. All very interesting, right? But guess what? No matter how much I followed these new colonos, these new immigrants to Latin America, they always ended up choqueando, bumping up against a frontier that was the Americas before Europe and that was unevenly colonized by the Spanish. So it turns out that this entire region that I'm going to call Wallmapu, and I'll explain why, there was no Argentina or Chile back when the people called the Mapuche regarded this as their land. And as you can tell, the colored area that I'm calling Wallmapu, because the Mapuche people represent their territory that way, sits on two current countries, but the southern parts of those countries had not been integrated into their nation states yet and wouldn't be until the late 19th century. So this is the frontier of Latin American history, and it's a very special one. Another thing I'd like to say is when you represent indigenous people and you know your Latin American history, you represent people with caciques and communities who spoke Spanish for the most part and were subject to two different regimes of law, Spanish regime of law and indigenous regime of law, the República de Indias. They had communal lands. They had a certain degree of autonomy within the colonial system. Some will say they had more rights, for example, than African descended people. Their slavery was eliminated in the 1540s, very early on in the Spanish colonial enterprise. And most of them had a connection to a large state, either Anahuac, or the Aztecs, or Tawantinsuyo, the Inca state, by the time the Spanish arrived. The Mapuche, totally different. They had no contact, or very little. They had actually resisted the Inca. Right? So I'm talking about an agricultural civilization that did not develop a central state. That's rare. That did not live under the tutelage of a large imperial state like the Inca. That's rare, right? But on the other hand, was sufficiently coherently united through a lineage system of authority that managed regional life and development and diplomacy and things like that in a coded way. You might call it Mapuche law, although most of it was not written down, right? That was sufficiently efficient and flexible to incorporate hunter-gatherer populations and frontier populations at various moments in the formation of the Mapuche people. Mapuche are not a tribe. They don't all descend from one identity or one stream of American, Native American history. They don't view themselves necessarily as a people always, but coalesce as a people in the face of danger. Their leadership adjusts to the arrival of a war or a colonial attempt on their sovereignty, and they will elevate warriors, chafe, and demote the usual civilian leaders from the family and community levels and coalesce into kind of a warrior path. These are people who resisted the Inca, the Spanish, and the state of Chile until the last decades of the 19th century. In both Argentina and Chile, they were conquered and reduced at the same time, or right after, which is at the period in which Native Americans were being conquered and swept away into reservations on the American frontier as well. So on those, sort of the two extremes of the frontier history. What happened to them when they lost those wars? The wars of the desert, or the wars of pacification, as they were called. They were put into reducciones. They were taken off of their ancestral lands and put on and given, property over small plots of usually undesirable land on which to subsist. And there was a concerted effort to turn them into employees of the railroad or of other development initiatives, the typical story of proletarianization. Their land was not sufficient for them to subsist as a community, and there were very hard pressures on their health. There were no clinics or hospitals in southern Chile at the time. The educational system, which only began in the beginning of the 20th century to reach them, was in Spanish. Most of them spoke Mapunzungun, which was the language that unified all the Mapuche. They never really were at peace with the fact that when they crossed the Andes, they had to now cross a border and present a document because the Argentine and Chilean sides were separated. Again, this was only achieved at the end of the 19th century. That border did not exist before, and they were used to crossing it fluently. Also, when you go down there, if you look for colorful dress, like the Maya, or you look for, beautiful artifacts, you'll find them in some places like on Chiloé, but most Mapuche people today, if you did a DNA, they would be mestizos, right? They would have some kind of connection with the Spanish over time. So discussions about authenticity, what it means to be indigenous, what exactly is a Mapuche are fascinating questions. That introduction was way too long, but that's what I'm going to talk about today. And I'd also like to say that you have to understand this period, this region that I'm talking about, especially in Chile, and the time period I'm talking about, which is, the contemporary period. You'll see it with roots in colonialism. It's very important for us to understand the world as it is today, because Augusto Pinochet, who was the military leader of Chile after September 11th, 1973, when he overthrew a liberal democracy that had for 2 years been managed by a socialist president, Salvador Allende. Pinochet, with the help of American economists and the help of course, European diplomats, launched a revolution in the Chilean economy that would then impact the world economy, which is called neoliberalism. Massive privatization, especially of natural resources. And that dictatorship came on the heels of some very strong mobilizations for land reform, for indigenous rights, and things like that, right? So Augusto Pinochet was a conservative Catholic man who believed in the blind hand of the market, so to speak, as the organizer of civilization. And the first thing he did was he stopped saying Mapuche and called them Araucanos, which is what the Spanish called them 500 years ago when they first noticed this nation to their south. And he also used the great warrior stories of the Araucanos against the Spanish as evidence that the Chilean nation was a nation of warriors, where a great indigenous heritage, the Araucano heritage, and the Spanish heritage had met. But that theory ends right there. What he now said was, meanwhile, there is no more there are no more Mapuche in Chile. We are all Chileans. They have been assimilated. That was the colonial past. We now have a happy family in which, of course, all of the lands that were distributed to Mapuche during the agrarian reform would be sold off and privatized. And most of the communal lands would be used for extraction, mostly of trees for lumber and other such extractive industries. So you'll understand why that's important in a minute. The loss of lands added to local tensions with large landowners and new business entrepreneurs who had invested in Mapuche land and therefore had titles. So as you know, there's always a conflict over titles of land. Most Native American claims to land are not based on actual titles because, one, they didn't have private property before the Spanish came, or two, the type of property that was assigned by the Spanish to the land did not correspond to their understanding of usufruct or of use of the land, right? And three, of course, in a capitalist society, private property belongs to one person or one corporation, not to a community. Therefore, legally, you cannot be indigenous in the way that people imagine indigenous community. Indigenous people today in Mapuche, they have what I call a long memory of events, all right? They'll bring everything back to the original encounter with the Spanish. So just like any nation, and I think the Mapuche can legitimately be called the nation in formation, even though they are minorities in existing nation states, they have their story. And their story is a counterpoint to the Spanish story that we know. their main theme is anti-colonial rebellion. Like, they see the defeat at the hands of the Chilean state in the 1880s and 1890s as a disaster, and as everything that came later as an attempt to survive, including participation in nationalist governments and populist governments, all the way up to the Unidad Popular in the 1970s. But we have to be careful. You know, yes, they've been subjected to a lot of violence, but as Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui, the Bolivian social scientist, has argued, we really have to be careful not to have a kind of pity, you know, for oppressed people and kind of always define who the Mapuche are based on their oppression or on their marginalization. The Mapuche people have cracked but not broken under the pressure as they've consistently battled Republican colonialism. They've deployed political strategies of resistance and sought anti-colonial transformation, whether through writing, various forms of denial, education, the staging of uprisings to take back land, or struggles for autonomy. In effect, the formation of multiple strategies of resistance is part of an ongoing permanent rebellion, driven and actualized through the long memory of the Mapuche people. Originally, the Spanish arrived, led by Pedro Valdivia, who has a city named after him, in the early 1500s. There was a Mapuche and Huiliche, another people that lived along the coast where Valdivia is, in the middle of Ngulmapu in central Chile. That leader, Pedro Valdivia, was killed in battle, and the Spanish were expelled, with only a few colonies remaining, one on the island of Chiloé and one near the city of Valdivia itself. All of the, yeah?
Sorry, I was going to ask, he was the leader of what?
Spain. But Pedro Valdivia was supposedly the Hernán Cortés of Chile, the discoverer, right? He did not survive, and all of the colonial outposts were destroyed by the Mapuche. So there effectively was no Spanish control on the southern border of the Spanish Empire. The authorities of the Capitanía General de Chile were based in Lima, Peru, and they controlled Chile up to the level more or less of about 20 or 100 miles south of what is now Santiago. And there was a territory called Laforcade along a river called the Biobío, which remains in the minds of anybody who's traveled or lived there as La Frontera, as the place where Chile ended and Wallmapu began, historically. So the boundaries between the present-day Argentine and Chilean republics weren't drawn until 1881, recognizing the Cordillera de los Andes, the mountain range, as the separation between the two. That's very recent. There'd never been an actual boundary. Indigenous peoples crossed it both ways and interacted with one another since time immemorial. Once people living on the western side became Chileans, though, they migrated to the lands of Neuquén on the Argentine side, and they were simply continuing the trend, only now they're seen as colonists or immigrant settlers. So Argentines see Mapuche people as Chilean Indians invading Argentine territory, as having their roots on the wrong side of that border dispute and being foreigners, which of course makes no sense from the indigenous point of view. What existed during the colonial period was a zona fronteriza. The expression for Mapuche was indios fronterizos, or borderland Indians. It appears in dictionaries for the first time in 1732, separating Spain from Mapuche lands, which were known as the state of Arauco, Estado de Arauco. So the Spanish recognized the Mapuche as a people, as a nation, as far as you could theorize a nation in the 1700s, right? And they gave them a state. In other words, for the purposes of diplomacy, they projected their European forms of sovereignty on the Mapuche, and parlamentos, which were essentially UN-style powwow meetings, on Mapuche terms with Mapuche ceremonials, were the way the Spanish and the Mapuche did diplomacy for over 100 years on La Frontera. So the other people around there, like the Huiliche, the Mapuche, they have shared origins of linguistic and cultural similarities, but regarded themselves as neighbors rather than a single people. Yes, this is a nation, but in formation. They all have their different names and their associations with natural habitats in the region. Yuncos on the coast, who now live on Chiloé as well. And on the other side of the Andes, Pehuenches, Puelches, Poyas, these were all names that the indigenous people had for themselves. All of them saw themselves as distinct, but were categorized by the Spanish as Indians. They were referred to in colonial records as Mapuches or Araucanos, and we've used the terms interchangeably. Their political traditions, territorial lineages, dress, cultivation of potatoes, corn, and quinoa, pastoral keeping of llama, or local chirihuecas they were called. They were all identical and they shared one language. Like other peoples of the area, they had no hierarchical society or state and shared the authority of loncos or caciques, who were local chiefs. Puelches of what is now the Argentine Pampas interacted with Huilichos on their own western frontier and with Spaniards in Chiloé. They had their own languages but underwent cultural changes and became part gradually of the Mapuche world. So people become Mapuche over time, before and after colonialism. What's interesting about this is they then unbecome Mapuche with urbanization and cities and migration and things like that until they want to connect back with their Mapuche roots. So don't see this as kind of this static indigenous identity that can be, characterized as a minority group. It really is a phenomenon within Chilean society, the existence of an subaltern, autonomous Mapuche culture in constant flux, constantly changing, and constantly borrowing from ancient and from contemporary history. So this is typically what is usually called as ethnogenesis when referring to the formation of national identity. So what united all these people was hostility to the Spanish and hostility to the conquest by the Inca of the northern provinces. Then there were people who came from the south, from Patagonia, which is the extreme south of South America. They would migrate up to the Rio de la Plata to around Buenos Aires. Now, if you go to Buenos Aires today, it's this massive city with a lot of immigrant heritage, but the only signs of an indigenous presence are archaeological findings around the port of Buenos Aires, right? In fact, you have to understand that in the 19th century, the Mapuche lived there all around the city. They were part of the fabric of what is now Buenos Aires province. And the further you go down in the Pampas, which the Argentine oligarchy conquered in order to create these huge grazing fields for South American beef and grow wheat during the period of Argentine ascent, those people have been erased from the historical record. But they were known. They were called Patagones, these people, by the Spanish, and eventually they came into the contact with Mapuche on both sides of the Cordillera and adopted the Mapuzungun language and became part of a larger Walmapu community. Mapuche means people of the land. Their language is Mapuzungun. It's taught in some universities now in Chile. It's a beautiful language with a lot of history. But there's no socio-political unity. Lineages formed confederations only when necessary for war or commerce, and then would disperse again. The existence of the border in which the Spanish stopped fighting against the Araucanos didn't entail the end of conflict. It just established a more centralized Mapuche governance than that which had existed before the Spanish invasion. And eventually the diversity of components of the society we now call Mapuche gradually became integrated into the defense of the frontera and commerce with the Spanish side. So naturally, by consent or coercion, unions between Mapuche and Spanish colonists occurred over a period of several hundred years, and certain patronyms with ties to both communities of origin, so to speak, were common. In other words, Mapuche society was never autarkic, never truly separate. In Chile, many historians and social scientists who devote themselves to the task of defining their nation as one and indivisible use this mestizaje, or this evidence of mixity on a racial level, as a way of classifying the Mapuche as Chilean rather than purely indigenous. So do you look at blood quorum to measure how indigenous a person is? And do you deny a person's preference for a collective identity that is indigenous on the grounds that they have Spanish ancestors? That's a question that's actually up for debate in Chile. So for them, there's a clear line of separation. The way the Mapuche designate people like me, Winca, means thief, right? So I am part of an outside Winca. It basically means thief, somebody who came and takes something that's not theirs. And it's a slur, but it's also become a common term for the other. And I don't take it personally. Mapuche accuse each other of becoming awinquesados when they become essentially Uncle Toms, as they say in the United States, and cross over to a more mainstream Chilean culture. Again, in all of indigenous history in the Southern Americas, this thing called cholaje, which is essentially not just biological but cultural mixture, is very common. There is hybridity. Cholificación is a term invented by Aníbal social scientist Aníbal Quijano, which was initiated with Spanish colonialism, blending Western urban idioms and lifestyles into the lives of indigenous peasantries without thoroughly eliminating traditional ones. So Huáscar Rodríguez Garcia, Bolivian, of Aymara descent, argues that in the 19th century the plebeian populacho cholo was stigmatized by Andean oligarchies as provincial, volatile, sexually and socially transgressive, disorderly, and racially deviant. In the early 20th century, it became identified with urban indigenous poor, struggling to preserve their economic independence and cultural autonomy in fledgling cosmopolitan cities, as a liminal social position between traditional and modern culture. So if you ask a middle-class Chilean today, what to you is a Mapuche, they'll say, a poor person from the south, poorly integrated into the fabric of the Chilean nation state, even without knowing anything about the Mapuche. So unlike Quechua, Aymara, Guarani, and other peoples who lived under Spanish colonialism, though, the Mapuche lived alongside and away from them, a sovereign nation unencumbered by the courts and commandments of the Spanish Empire. Beginning in Quillín in 1641, they established these parliaments as a place of encounter and diplomacy between two sovereign entities. And eventually, the Europeans, or the lineages of men who were skilled at establishing diplomatic ties with the Europeans, would be elevated to governance in Mapuche politics. Eventually, the Mapuche were pivotal in creating supply routes for frontiersmen, both in Argentina and Chile, who were trying to do business with the Spanish Empire. They would adopt ancient routes of indigenous migration to create new, circuits of trade and commerce for Europeans. They became guides for the exploration and ultimately the conquest of Gualmapu and of Patagonia. They had the knowledge. They didn't do this to surrender to any empire or with the knowledge that a new order called capitalism would ultimately befall upon them, right? No, they did this because they regarded these people as partners. Gualmapu and the Reinado de España were just essentially helping each other out, doing business with each other, resolving problems in court or in parliament, and being sovereign nations. So eventually, when Buenos Aires became the capital of the new viceroyalty in 1776, of course, there started to be tensions. There started to be fights in South America over who would control this vast region, which was the outskirts of the Spanish Empire. The Creole elite attempted to maintain control over the viceroyalty, and there were these drawn-out divisions. Paraguay separated. There were campaigns by José Artigas, a federalist. The independence movement in Chile was originally defeated by the monarchists, so that Chile failed for the first time to become independent of the monarchical authorities in Lima. And eventually San Martin came in from Argentina and changed the tide. Yes, there were some Mapuche who contributed to the independence wars. They had skills, they were scouts, but they were mostly interested in the growth of cross-border migration and economic opportunities that were created by independence. So there were huge opportunities also for the investors from Europe, the estancieros, who, after the end of the Napoleonic Wars, started exporting on a large scale to Europe. Eventually, in the 1850s and 1860s, indigenous forces had the upper hand in holding back the expansion of, capitalists in their attempt to seize the land for export. So as late as the 1860s, right around the American Civil War, it was not written that the Mapuche nation would disappear or that the Mapuche were too weak to resist the advance of the colonial project of the nation state. The occupied ranches in Rio Negro, they herded runaway cattle and they sold it to colonists, as smugglers, basically. One of the motives for these famous malones, or raids that they did on horseback, was to steal cattle, breed, and sell it, and become a competitor, with the hacendados. There was an informal economy that was much like the relations between Spain and Morocco in the colonial era, alternating between peace and conflict. The streams of white colonization in 1880, as I said, followed different streams of population in the history of the Mapuche. I went into a long description of this because it's phenomenal, how the colonization of Europeans did not follow just a Atlantic history, Paris or Barcelona to Buenos Aires and then within, but on the contrary, Europeans came in all over the coast and followed indigenous paths into the Pampas and into the Cordillera. So, Wallmapu is really more than the name of just a territory. To people who remember it today, who are trying to turn it into a possible geographic staging for a modern-day autonomy, it's epistemic resistance. It's a concept of space-time linked to both physical territory and historical identity. I'm going to shorten this, but I have a few things to say that are important. Mapu is a polysemic term usually translated as land, and Che means people. So, when we use the concept of Mapuche, a friend of mine, a Wenteche scholar named Jose Quidel, when we use the concept of Mapu, we're not referring to the land proper. It's a term that applies to all the dimensions of life in the universe. The cosmos is also Mapu. In terms of the organization of the land, historically, before and after the arrival of the Spanish, Lof and Rewe were the two basic expressions of socio-political organization. So that's lineage and community. And the Futal Mapu was the larger territory that organized the affinities between them. Futa means greater, the greater Mapu or land. Prior to the arrival of the Spanish, there were 4 physical regions of the Mapu in which culture and language were shared, and horizontal relations between Lof and Rewe were organized. Differences were seen as based on ecology and extended lineage, rather than on what we now refer to as ethnicity. They referred to places and natural environments with which people were in relation. So Lafken was the name of the sea, Lafkenche, the people of the sea. Wenteche, Pewenche, Nagche, etc. are not separate ethnicities, but ways of embodying the habitat of and the traditions of a particular region. Mapuche emerged among those peoples as Toa, or self-identity, as diverse groups of a common origin and language whose territorial idiosyncrasies and interrelatedness compose the broader Wallmapu. They are not majoritarian there, but they are inscribed in the landscape there. The people and the land are not two separate things. Boundaries of Wallmapu are not fixed in time or even place. They evolve, but the memory of the regions that compose it led to new designations, such as Gulu Mapu west of the Andes mountain range and Puel Mapu to the east, as Mapuche were displaced from or dispersed within both and held on to the story of their origins. It's a discourse intimately related to the disasters of the pacification of Araucania in Chile and the conquest of the desert in Argentina, which deepened the longing for an ancestral understanding of space and time in defiance of nationalist and capital dispossession. It's not about just territory, it's a philosophy. Wallmapu means Mapuche country. It's not outlined by physical borders, but as a space within which Mapuche resistance to Winca colonialism is ongoing. Physically, it's land, a civilization really, that is thought of as having been lost. And its invocation in contemporary times is about recuperation against the civilizing mission, central state authority, and most importantly, extractive pillaging of the land for resources by private transnational companies who are no more bound by national constraints than they are. So the fragmentation of Gulu Mapu and Puel Mapu in Chile and Argentina was seen as an absolute disaster, right, from Mapuche, and the use of place names today is criminalized by both nations. If you use the Mapuche terms for places, you break the law. When talking about Wallmapu, the intention is not to homogenize the communities that make it up, but rather to show a paradigmatic process in the different struggles of Latin America. Even within the Lof, or villages, and Rewe, or voluntary groups of Lof in a contiguous local territory, of the same Futal Mapu, there are many differences and autonomies. Mapuche historians say this was never Chile or Argentina. This has always been Mapuche country, but they see the nation state, their citizen cards as Chilean or Argentine, as a parenthesis in space and time, something that is not forever, that is a state of exception, that imprisons them in another concept of relation to the land and to the state. So Mapuche peoples from both sides of the Andes deal with different legal and political systems and have their own forms of organization. But they seek to coordinate on the basis of the ancestral concept of Wallmapu, land recovery, autonomy, not only of the state, but of political representation. They don't want to be a minority within a large nation. They're 10% in Chile, according to census, right? They want to be the principal mode of organization and sovereignty within the lands where they are a majority. País, an old European word that means country and nation in all languages in Europe, but really means locality. And historically, from the Middle Ages, the país was your community, it was a place that you understood. It was the fiefdom to which you had economic and political ties. And the país grew into the nation state over time in Europe. These are different concepts in Latin America, but país refers to the land that is autonomous, and nation is the expression of what unites all of the autonomous units. So when the Mapuche say we want autonomy, they don't want to become a state, they don't want to be part of a state, but they recognize that they are a form of autonomy within a state, which would be Chile or Argentina. And they would have to create an intermediary form of governance, kind of like the one that only the Inuit people of northern Canada, Alaska, and Greenland actually legally have today, as far as I know, with one exception, I think, at Panama. So they do believe that they are a nation, and that conflicts with Chilean governmentality, for which I could go into some detail, but let me finish here with just a couple of ideas. Number one, imagine the Mapuche going through a century of proletarianization, physical reduction or removal, eviction, forced migration, as not just an exception, but the rule of how they were managed within the new nations. This radicalized Mapuche demands and elevated the Huaychafe, or the warriors, to a higher level of authority in the Futal Mapu. So when people say, oh, these are riotous, revolting people, they don't want to be part of Chile or whatever, that's because over time they've delegated authority to their military, basically, and said, listen, find a way to build another frontera that the enemy will not be able to cross, right, without dealing with us on an equal level. So they view, and there is currently a guerrilla movement led by a fraction of Mapuche, not the majority, called the Coordinadora Arauco the CAM. I forget the total name of it. But they actually, their main focus is not on attacking the Chilean state. They do not attack civilians. They do not practice terrorism of any kind. They're not trying to seize power. Their sole function is to tear down, burn, and block the entrances and buildings and facilities of transnational companies that have been given a green light and a tax-free ticket by the Chilean state to extract everything they can, minerals, trees, from the land, all right? So the Mapuche are waging an ecological war to stop the progress of global extractive capitalism in what they consider to be their sacred lands. When it comes to who these people are, Héctor Liatul, an imprisoned Huaychafe who published a book with Chilean scholar Jorge Arrate, he says Huanmapu is undergoing its third invasion. The first was by the Spanish crown, the second by national states, and the third by transnational capital in the context of extractive neoliberal economic development. So he says this, the return of the Huaychafe requires thinking about yesteryear and today and relating them. Leftrartu, so this is a hero of Mapuche resistance, infiltrated the Spanish world and understood that being there allowed him to learn. In today's circumstances, the dominant Western culture must also be a terrain for us that allows us to learn. At present, the experience gathered from the world that dominates us must support the actions of a strengthened Huaychafe, in permanent training, who is a multifaceted fighter, so to speak, with the capacity for expedition in each area in which he must act, but maintenance and always recovering our Mapuche uniqueness. This openness to change and adaptation is characteristic of Mapuche heritage or history on both sides of the mountain range. He writes, in both Chile and Argentina, plundering and the usurpation of the territory prevailed. Currently, we do not enter into that debate about what Hualmapu was at the time. We work with historical periods and with the idea of territoriality that's possible to sustain in the time we live in. And what's interesting is that Yatul himself came from a displaced family of a deterritorialized Mapuche diaspora who did not grow up in a community, but was, as he says, transculturated in the Winca world, the white world, and advocates the possibility of re-entering Mapuche culture and society through political action. As he says, me Mapuchise, I became Mapucheized. He's the supreme leader of the armed wing of the CAM. This open and inclusive vision of Hualmapu regards the historical diversity of the Mapuche people as a strength and their liminal positions in frontier zones, both urban and rural, as a defining element of the Mapuche nation, as it seeks to reconstruct the system of articulated horizontal and local governance represented by the ancestral Lof, Rewe, and Fultal Mapu. Now let me, without going into the details of modern policy, say this. If you are a Republican Chilean, meaning someone who advocates the sovereign state of Chile, you believe that the conquest of the South was final, and that the people, whether in a subordinate position or not, have become Chilean with the rights and duties to the Chilean state that everyone has. There can be no autonomy because Chilean rights have to be the same for everybody. There cannot be a multicultural policy of giving special rights of affirmative action to any minority group. Now, this is unfamiliar to Americans who do have a kind of liberal multicultural outlook, but the French, Spanish, positivistic rendering of the modern-day republic prohibits the recognition of ethnicity as a factor in national identity. Everyone must assimilate into a national contract that is a civic one. You can keep your religion, you can talk whatever you want at home, but civically you are French and you defend the republic, right? So whether you are a Marxist, and Chilean Marxists have historically regarded the Mapuche as peasants, not as Mapuche, right? Oh, they have indigenous characteristics, but they're basically proletarianized peasants. They have tried to impose reforms and a discourse of revolutionary political action on Mapuche communities with mixed results. If you're conservative, Catholic, and you believe that the Chilean state is fighting against foreign enemies, I'm about to end, and in the face of sort of elimination, right, then for you, the land is hallowed, it's sacred. God brought the Chileans there to civilize it and to preserve it, right? And therefore, the Mapuche, who, by the way, have been heavily transformed by missionaries, mostly Catholic missionaries historically, are part of a Chilean fabric that is essential going back to the warriors that they celebrate in their version of Mapuche history. So the right and the left in Chile do not see autonomy as anything but an attempt at secession or an attempt at reifying racial or ethnic differences and turning them into a political bombshell. So in the Bolivian plurinational republic, which is a real thing, I'm sure you followed Evo Morales and the revolutionizing of Bolivian governance, bringing in indigenous communities as part of a plurinational project, similar to what Russia had in the 19th century, where you have many different nations living under a single political state, but they all have their own identity, right? This was proposed by Chilean intellectuals in a recent constitutional reform and was rejected overwhelmingly by 60 or 70% of the vote. Mainly people who may not have confessed, who may not be willing to admit their racial biases and their dislike of these mysterious, rowdy, untamed people from another time in the southern provinces, right? But what they will tell you is any attempt to dismantle the architecture of the Chilean state, and the Argentines feel the same way, is some kind of international, multinational corporate strategy to weaken national sovereignty, right? And promote interests that are not our own. So there is a kind of an impossibility to communicate there. On the one hand, most of the Mapuche who are organized, and they come from all the political spectrum, ranging from communist to Christian Democrat to radical autonomists, who now have the upper hand, right? But they're trying to make Chile a place that acknowledges its diversity, decentralizes its governance, and essentially atones for an ethnocide that was not just a parenthesis in the history, but the founding experience of the Chilean state, right? And on the other side, you have people who believe that this Western globalized conversation about disappearing sovereignty and about just turning the world into one big global market is a severe threat to our national identity. So I think you're gonna see, and I'm studying this in various parts of the world, a showdown not like the one in the period of decolonization where people were fighting for their national independence against an established colonial state, right? What you're going to see now is, in peripheral areas of the world, anybody who is a nomad or an indigenous or a recent migrant to a part of the world that is poorly organized politically, right, but is crucial to the modern economy. In other words, there's nickel or uranium or gas or anything like that that's precious, right? You're going to see massive warfare in these areas, which is not even about state formation or sovereignty or autonomy, but about clearing the way for a certain kind of economic activity that is incompatible with a healthy community sustaining life for the people who live there. And at some point, we're going to have to enter into a conversation about that idea that I was talking about, the Walmapu idea, right? That people are not just people using the land. They are the land. They are guests in an environment or a habitat that it is their paramount duty to protect, right? And if we instill this a little bit in Chilean mainstream culture, you know, a lot of the Mapuche today, I forgot to mention, live in cities, so that's 40%, that's quite a bit, right? They're young people who bring these ideals to modern political discussions and who are making every effort through popular culture, including rap, including hip hop and all these things, to reconnect with their ancestral history and to Mapuchizar themselves in order to become better citizens of the world and in order to develop a conversation that is more about sustainability than about extractivism. So that's where, that's basically the community that I'm studying in Chile. Thank you very much. And maybe some other time I'll read you the other 25 pages.
All right, we understand that some people might need to leave for classes, but we do have time for a couple of questions. So if you do have a question, please raise your hand. I'll bring you the microphone, give us your name, what you study, and ask your question. Ted, do you have a question?
Very good presentation. Thank you very much. Up until 3 or 4 years ago, I had been reading quite a bit about the Mapuches putting salt or dirt in gas tanks of big trucks, blowing up trucks, so on. I am not reading very much about that right now. My question is there enough social organization among the, I'm referring to Chile, I really don't know Argentina,
right.
Enough social organization in Chile to be effective, to have a future effect. So we're asking you to kind of point to the future, and is there a social organization enough to make it work?
All right, any other questions that I could blend into this one? Yeah?
Yeah, I guess you can hear me, but I'll just say. Yeah, I think that ties into it because going off of your last point about, there being, warfare for this area, for, a way of life and a way of economy that isn't, compatible with, the Mapuche, I guess you could say, cosmovision and everything. Do you think that's already going on? Because, you just had recently someone, disappearance and they found, Julia Chuñil, like her body burner, Camilo Catrillanca back in I think 2019. Do you think that's already somewhat started and that it's just going to continue to move forward?
The problem is that the government, which claims to be progressive in Chile, is reacting with anti-terrorist laws and is carrying out sweeping, Donald Trump-style military expeditions to get activists of the CAM, the main autonomous group, but they're calling it a terrorist threat rather than a political proposition or something that can be negotiated with. Regarding the social organization, there's a long tradition of Mapuche organization around educational policy and land reform in the Chilean political system. They participated in the land reform of Eduardo Frei in the 1950s. They participated in land reform of Salvador Allende in the 1970s. What happened after that is that communities themselves were dispersed and organizations made illegal under Pinochet. But all of those activists who had worked on some level on the agrarian reforms and educational policy went to Europe and formed a kind of critical diaspora that thought about the future of Chile post-dictatorship without being in Chile. They contributed to a lot of research on Mapuche history and on Chile, and so a lot of the fuentes, the sources for this are outside of Chile. And then they returned during democratization under Michelle Bachelet and worked very closely with her government. So, you know, the leaders of these communities do not obey each other. There's no supreme command, right? So there are federations, you know, the different Futalmapu, who at one point will see a positive policy coming from the state, building of schools, you know, water projects, things like that, and will engage and will therefore be represented somewhere in the state bureaucracy. You have universities that are heavily Mapuche in terms of their student body and their faculty now. So you have what you have is a kind of Mapuche social science, I would say, rather than social organization, right? They definitely have a notion that autonomy is possible and coexistence with the Chilean state just by taking out of central government certain functions of regional management, resource management, food, you know, things like that, schools, and still cooperating with state agencies for the fundamental infrastructure, the roads, and, you know, the defense of the country and things like that. So is there political support for that? Yes. However, the inability to discuss autonomy as a legal framework, you are right to raise the question because it actually has not succeeded anywhere other than in Inuit country, right? It's phenomenal that with all the history of indigenous movements, Colombia, Ecuador have put multicultural indigenous rights into their constitutions. So has Brazil. Mexico has its own relationship with its indigenous population, very diverse. They've allowed the Zapatista phenomenon, but there's no legal autonomy. It's a state of exception. What the Mapuche want is something that has only been practiced in areas where there is no strong state, such as the Kurds in northern Syria, right? They want local horizontal governance open to all who live there. So, for example, Capitan Pastene, where I tend to go, in the middle of Mapuche country, has a huge Italian population and other colonos from Germany and whatever. German further south. There's no reason why these Italians and these Germans couldn't participate, you know, equally with the Mapuche in a local governance that, rather than count everybody, right, sees the aménagement du territoire, as we say in French, right, the management of the territory, as a priority for the collective good. The definition of what is the commons, which is a big philosophical conversation for us too in the industrialized world. What they're saying is the commons is local management of resources and local decision making about the steps of education, the creation of small-scale economic activity, the recreation of a sort of artisan marketplace, and the keeping at bay of multinational expansion. They now view the Chilean state as the armed wing of, you know, McDonald's and Microsoft. You know, so it's less a struggle for power in the government than a pushing back, just like they did against the Spanish, of the frontier of extractive expansion. And what is impossible to deny is that we are all part of this. We need that expansion to happen, whether it's in the Congo or in Chile or in West Africa, for our material needs. Yet we cannot afford the ecological and demographic consequences of ethnocide and genocide that our governance over those resources would imply. Maybe in the 19th century we could justify it. Right? Colonialism is gone. So what do we do? How do we reduce the ability of a central bureaucracy and a military force to confine and constrain the everyday politics of entire communities over large regions? That's the question. There's a lot of support for that question and very little answers. The CAM, the CAM, Coordinadora Arauca Mayeque, I think it's called, Mayeco. That is the vanguard group of remaining Marxist intellectuals who have basically decided that they're going to engage in direct action and sabotage against the foreign occupiers and make peace, or condition peace, on a dialogue over Mapuche autonomy with the Chilean state, which ended after the constitutional vote. All of the leadership is in jail. They're being driven into martyrdom so that some of their names are talked about the way the great warriors of Mapuche resistance to the Spanish in the 1500s and 1600s. It's not healthy, right? The other thing is they also have branches in Neuquén on the other side of the border. And one of their biggest things is to denationalize the passages across the Andes. So they're viewed in Argentina as secessionists and seditious. And they also come under terrorist laws. It's very hard to have a cultural life, a kind of transnational form of just even cultural cooperation and uplift, when you've got two governments that have decided that you are the eternal enemy and that what you say you represent must be eliminated from the social fabric altogether in order for all the organs of the nation to work. You know? And it's that organicist model of a country. It has to have closed borders in the central government, and all sovereignties within it are lost. That I don't think is going to survive this. But in order to understand why it's falling apart, we need to understand what it is. That's why I study the French model of Third Republic, you know, centralism, and what it did in the colonies and beyond, because many of the constitutions in South America imitated the French Constitution. Diego Portales, you know, all of their influences, their legal influences and their Enlightenment influences were the same as in France. So I think one of the things we seldom talk about is the modes of governance that colonialism has provided the world with are not necessarily compatible with the exigencies of sovereignty and development in the places that are now sovereign, free, right? We haven't replaced colonialism with anything except militarized states and kleptocratic governments. And we've come to believe that that's just the way of the third world, that they're somehow savages who have nothing else to propose. So when I talk about the way the Lof and the Rewe and the Futalmapu are organized and their vision of the ecology, the habitat, how economy and decision-making and religion are organized, I'm not saying that's an alternative model for a state. I'm saying let's listen to what is actually constructive society building in another tradition and see how we can create compatible connections with our ideas of institutionality and freedom. That's the only path forward. We have to be able to decolonize our minds and understand other epistemologies. Just yesterday or the day before, I was in San Francisco talking about the Tuareg on the, you know, in the Sahelian borderlands of West Africa, all of which are chased down as terrorists by national governments today in the name of progressivism and anti-imperialism and anti-jihadism, right? They want the same thing as the Mapuche, only they're nomads. And again, when you study their philosophy and the way they were organized before colonialism and how they conceive of autonomy, there's some very rich ideas there that we could use instead of just fearing them and trying to get rid of their, you know, physically get rid of the problem. There is something genocidal about the denial of the existence of alternative sovereignties within a state.
Hunt them down for rewards.
Yeah, it's the far west down there. So I don't want to create a sense of, oh, the Mapuche are heroic and they should be free, or that they've been victimized and for their entire, you know, civilization and must be somehow repaid, or, you know, I'm not talking about that kind of anti-colonial activism. I'm saying there is no peace, no stability, and no future the way the Argentine and Chilean states are organized in Wallmapu. And if your only hang-up is to say, well, Wallmapu no longer exists because we destroyed it, which is also how we talk about the West in the United States, right? That's not enough for the people who remember that catastrophe over the long memory. They don't want the territories back. They want to push the colonizers out, you know, and then remain with whoever remains as a more democratic, more federalist, more decentralized, and more ecologically friendly society. So that's the attraction. Rather than to go in and have another discussion about, for example, in Bolivia, there's Catarismo, which is Marxist indigenism, and, you know, Zapatismo in Mexico. These are all interesting, but there's no one way to enter into dialogue with an indigenous culture. And the Chilean and Argentine case is interesting because the dialogue is recent, even though the connection is longer. Yeah.
Very much.
Well, thank you for staying. I mean, I went 10 minutes over what I thought, and I didn't even get to everything, but I just hope I gave you the curiosity to look into this and to understand what's going on down there, because we never hear about it.